The chandeliers inside the grand ballroom threw gold light across every face except one. Clara Sterling stood near the auction stage, her hands folded in front of her, wearing a heavy silk dress that had gone out of style 10 years ago. The fabric was a deep wine color, thick at the shoulders, with a high collar that didn't match anything else in the room. Around her, women in slim modern gowns whispered behind their champagne glasses. "Is that curtain fabric?" one of them said, not bothering to lower her voice. Clara heard it. She always heard it. 5 years of widowhood had taught her how to keep her face still while her chest tightened underneath. She wasn't here for the auction items or the champagne. She was here because a name on the guest list had caught her eye 3 days ago. A name connected to a man her husband used to trust. Julian had been gone 5 years, and for 5 years she had worn this exact dress to exactly 2 events, waiting for someone from his old life to notice it and understand what it meant. Tonight was the 3rd time, and she was starting to think it would never work. The laughter grew louder. A woman in emerald green tilted her head at Clara and said something to her friend, and both of them broke into giggles that carried across the marble floor. Clara felt her face grow warm. She reached for her water glass just to have something to hold. That was when the room went quiet. It happened fast, the way weather changes fast right before a storm. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the string quartet in the corner seemed to lose a beat. Clara looked up, along with everyone else, toward the entrance of the ballroom. A man stood there in a black suit that fit him like it had been built onto his body. He was younger than she expected anyone with that kind of presence to be. Maybe 28, with dark hair combed back and sharp eyes that moved once across the room and settled on nothing in particular. Yet somehow, every person in that ballroom straightened their posture as if he'd looked directly at them. "That's Gabe Vance," someone whispered nearby. The same woman who'd laughed at Clara's dress a moment ago, except now her voice had lost all its confidence. Clara had heard the name before, not from gossip, but from Julian, years ago, mentioned once in passing over dinner, with a strange kind of respect in his voice. She hadn't thought about it in a long time. Gabe moved through the crowd, like the crowd was moving out of his way, rather than the other way around. Nobody approached him, nobody dared. He crossed the entire length of the ballroom, past the auction tables, past the ice sculptures, past every important person in New York who wanted his attention, and stopped directly in front of Clara. Up close, he was even harder to read. His eyes dropped to her dress for half a second, just long enough that she noticed it, and something changed in his expression. Not amusement, recognition. "That fabric," he said quietly, only to her. "Where did you get that fabric?" Clara's mouth went dry. "It was my husband's gift to me." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned toward the stage, where the auctioneer was holding up a small painting nobody particularly wanted, a minor piece worth maybe $8,000 on a good night. Gabe raised his hand. $100,000, he said. The room made a sound like a held breath finally released. The auctioneer blinked twice before finding his voice again. Gabe didn't even look at the painting. He looked at Clara, and for the benefit of everyone watching, he offered her his arm. "Come with me," he said. "Let them see you on the arm of someone who actually matters." Clara didn't move at first. Every instinct told her this was strange, that a stranger bidding 6 figures on an ugly painting just to stand beside her wasn't normal behavior from anyone, Mafia connections or not. But something in his eyes told her this wasn't about the painting, and it wasn't really about her dress either. It was about something underneath it. She took his arm. As they walked together across the ballroom, past the same women who had laughed at her 20 minutes earlier, now staring in open confusion, Gabe leaned down slightly, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Don't look now," he murmured, "but there are two men by the east exit who have been watching you since you arrived. They're not here for the auction." Clara's stomach dropped. She kept her eyes forward, her smile fixed, the way she'd trained herself to do for 5 years of pretending everything was fine. "Watching me how? The way men watch someone they've been sent to find," Gabe said. "Your husband's old rivals don't forget faces, Mrs. Sterling, and that dress just told them exactly where to look." The words landed like ice water down her spine. She'd worn this dress hoping to be recognized by someone who could help her. She hadn't considered that the wrong people might recognize it too. "You knew my husband," she said, not quite a question. Gabe's jaw tightened, just slightly, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, something almost like sadness crossed his face. "I knew exactly who your husband was," he said, "and I know exactly what happened to him. Smile for the room, Mrs. Sterling. We're leaving in 5 minutes, and I need you to trust me before we do." 5 minutes felt longer than Clara expected. Gabe kept her close as they made their way toward a side exit, stopping once to shake hands with a city councilman, twice to nod at people who clearly feared him more than they respected him. Through it all, his arm stayed steady under her hand, and his eyes never stopped moving across the room. "The men by the east exit," Clara whispered. "Are they still there?" "One of them left when I bid on the painting," Gabe said, his voice low and even, like he was discussing the weather. "The other is pretending to check his phone by the coat room. He's been pretending for the last 4 minutes." Clara's pulse climbed. She'd spent 5 years training herself not to panic, not to flinch, not to give anyone a reason to notice her. That training was the only thing keeping her spine straight now. "What do they want with me?" "That's what I intend to find out," Gabe said. "But not here." They reached a service hallway behind the kitchen, and Gabe's demeanor shifted the moment the ballroom doors closed behind them. 2 men in dark suits fell into step beside him, appearing so quickly Clara hadn't even seen where they came from. Neither of them said a word. They simply moved, one ahead, one behind, forming a loose wall around her without ever touching her. "This is Marcus," Gabe said, nodding to the taller one. "And Dell, they're going to make sure we get to the car without incident." "Incident?" Clara repeated. "You say that like it's a common word for you." "It is," Gabe said, and for just a second, something almost like humor flickered in his eyes. It disappeared just as fast. The parking garage was dim, lit by long fluorescent strips that buzzed faintly overhead. Clara's heels echoed against the concrete, louder than she wanted them to. She kept her eyes on Gabe's back, on the confident set of his shoulders, and tried not to look at every shadow between the parked cars. That was when she saw them. 2 men in black suits, positioned near a sedan close to where she'd parked her own car, watching the exit with the kind of stillness that came from training, not boredom. One of them straightened when he spotted her. "Keep walking," Gabe said quietly, not breaking stride. "Don't look at them. Don't slow down." Marcus peeled off first, angling his body between Clara and the 2 men, without appearing to do anything unusual at all. Dell moved up beside her, close enough that Clara could feel the tension radiating off him. The 2 men in black started walking too, matching their pace, closing the distance across the garage floor. "Mrs. Sterling," one of them called out, his voice pleasant in a way that made it worse. "We just want a moment of your time." Gabe didn't stop walking. He didn't even turn his head. "Not tonight," he said. his voice carrying just enough weight to make both men hesitate mid-step. "The lady has somewhere to be. This doesn't concern you, Vance. Everything in this city concerns me," Gabe said. "Ask around." There was a pause, the kind that stretched a few seconds too long, where Clara genuinely didn't know what would happen next. Then, without any signal Clara could see, both men stepped back. One of them gave a short nod, almost respectful, and the two of them turned and walked toward the garage exit like nothing had happened at all. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "That's it? They just left?" "For now," Gabe said, opening the door of a black armored sedan and guiding her inside. "They'll report back to whoever sent them. That buys us time, not safety." The car pulled out of the garage and onto the highway, city lights sliding past the windows in long yellow streaks. Clara sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the wine-colored dress suddenly feeling heavier than it had all night. "Who were they?" she asked. Gabe was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "Men who work for people your husband used to investigate. People he got too close to before he disappeared." The word disappeared landed hard. Clara had spent 5 years calling it that too, disappeared, because the alternative words felt too final, too much like giving up on him. "You said you knew exactly what happened to him. Tell me." "I will," Gabe said, "but not on a highway with a driver who reports to 3 different people I don't fully trust yet." He glanced at her, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. Julian was a good man, one of the only honest investigators who ever got close enough to my world to actually understand it instead of just judging it. I respected him. That's not something I say about many people. Clara's throat tightened. 5 years of silence, of official reports calling her husband a coward who ran from his debts, of in-laws who stopped speaking to her because they believed the same story. And here was a stranger, a dangerous one, telling her the opposite in the back of an armored car. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Gabe said. "Somewhere we can talk without anyone listening, and somewhere those men won't think to look tonight." Clara looked out the window as the city lights began to thin, replaced slowly by the dark outline of trees along the highway. She thought about the dress, about why she'd worn it, about the hope she'd carried into that ballroom and the fear she was carrying out of it now. Somewhere underneath both of those feelings was something she hadn't let herself feel in 5 years. Hope that someone finally believed her husband was innocent. The estate appeared out of the darkness like something from a different century. Stone walls covered in ivy, tall windows glowing amber against the night, the Hudson River visible in the distance as a black ribbon under the moon. Clara had expected something colder, more fortress-like, given who owned it. Instead, the place felt strangely warm, lived in, like someone actually spent quiet evenings here instead of just hiding from enemies. Gabe led her through the front entrance, past a wide staircase and into a study lined with bookshelves and a fireplace already burning low. Marcus and Dell peeled off toward the perimeter without a word, leaving the two of them alone for the first time all night. "You're safe here," Gabe said, gesturing toward a chair near the fire. "Nobody outside my inner circle knows this property exists." Clara sat down slowly, the heavy silk of her dress pooling around her legs. The warmth of the fire reached her skin, but the chill in her chest didn't leave. "You promised to tell me what happened to my husband." Gabe poured 2 glasses of something amber-colored and handed her one before sitting across from her. He didn't drink his, he just held it, turning it slowly in his hand while he chose his words. "Julian was investigating a corporate fraud case 5 years ago," he said. Not street crime, not the kind of thing people usually assume when they hear my name attached to a story. This was bigger. Billions moving through shell companies. Extortion, dressed up as legitimate business. He came to me because he needed someone who understood how that world actually worked, someone the official channels couldn't touch. He never told me any of this, Clara said quietly. He just started coming home later. Distracted, scared, though he never admitted it. He wouldn't have told you, Gabe said. Not because he didn't trust you. Because he loved you too much to put you in danger with what he knew. Clara's eyes stung, and she pressed her lips together to keep herself steady. Then why am I in danger now? He's been gone 5 years. Gabe leaned forward slightly. Because somebody thinks you're still holding on to something he left behind. The words hit her like cold water. She thought of the dress, of the hours she'd spent 5 years ago, carefully hand-stitching a hidden pocket into its heavy silk lining. Following instructions, Julian had scrawled on a torn piece of paper and pressed into her palm the night before he vanished. "Do this," he'd told her. "Don't ask why. Wear it only when you need help finding the truth." "He hid something in this dress," Clara whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the seam along her waist. "The night before he disappeared, he gave me instructions, said to trust no one, not even the police." I thought he was being paranoid. I almost threw the dress away 100 times. Gabe's eyes sharpened with focus. "What did he give you?" "I don't know exactly. Small, hard, wrapped in cloth. He told me to sew it into the lining myself, not to let a tailor touch it. I did it the same night, my hands shaking so badly I pricked myself a dozen times." She looked up at him. "I wore this dress to 2 events over the past 5 years, hoping someone from his old life would notice it and understand what it meant. Tonight was the 3rd time. I was starting to think it meant nothing." "It means everything," Gabe said. "Whatever Julian hid in there is likely the reason he disappeared in the first place. And it's the reason those men were watching you tonight. They didn't recognize you, Mrs. Sterling. They recognized the dress." Clara's stomach turned. 5 years of wearing this dress like a quiet signal into the dark, and she'd never once considered that the wrong people might be watching the same signal, waiting for her to wear it again. "Julian's rivals," she said slowly. "The ones you mentioned. They know he hid something." "They've suspected it for years," Gabe said. "They searched your house twice after he disappeared, didn't they? Small things moved. Nothing taken. You probably assumed it was your imagination." Clara's breath caught. She had noticed things out of place, back when the grief was too fresh to trust her own memory. She'd blamed herself for forgetting where she'd left things. "How do you know that?" "Because I had someone watching your house for the first year after Julian vanished," Gabe admitted. "Not to spy on you, to protect you, in case they came back for more than a search." The revelation should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, something in Clara loosened, a knot she'd been carrying for 5 years, without realizing how heavy it had become. Someone had believed Julian. Someone had cared enough to watch over the wreckage he left behind. "Show me," Gabe said gently, nodding toward her dress. "If you're willing, we can open the lining carefully, without damaging whatever's inside." Clara's fingers found the seam along her waist, the one she'd sewn shut with trembling hands 5 years ago, never once opening it since, terrified of what she might find or what she might lose if she did. Now, sitting in a stranger's study with a fire crackling and a man who somehow knew more about her husband's final days than she did, she finally felt ready. "Tomorrow," she said, "in the daylight, I want to see clearly what he left me." Gabe nodded, respect flickering across his face. "Tomorrow, then. Get some rest tonight, Mrs. Sterling. You're safer within these walls than you've been in 5 years. Clara looked toward the window, toward the dark shape of the river beyond the glass, and for the first time since Julian disappeared, she let herself believe that the truth was finally within reach. Morning light came through the tall windows of the study in soft gray bands, the kind of early light that made everything look calmer than it actually was. Clara hadn't slept much. She'd spent most of the night in the guest room turning Gabe's words over in her mind, and now, standing in the study with the dress laid flat across a long wooden table, her hands trembled the same way they had 5 years ago when she'd first sewn the seam shut. Gabe entered with a small case, setting it down carefully beside the dress. Inside were tools Clara didn't recognize, thin metal picks, tiny scissors, something that looked like a dentist's instrument bent into an odd shape. "We'll go slow," he said, pulling out a chair beside her. "Whatever's in there survived 5 years hidden in silk. I don't want to risk damaging it now." Clara nodded, though her throat felt tight. She ran her fingers along the waistline of the dress until she found the seam, slightly raised under the fabric, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. "Here," she said. "This is where I sewed it." Gabe examined the stitching closely, then picked up one of the thin tools. "Your husband knew what he was doing when he asked you to do this yourself instead of a tailor. A professional would have noticed the extra layer immediately." "He said the same thing," Clara murmured. "He said tailors talk. He didn't want anyone talking." The work was slow and careful, thread by thread, the two of them leaning close over the table as Gabe worked the seam open without tearing the surrounding fabric. Clara watched his hands, steady, despite the danger she now understood came with everything he touched. It struck her as strange. A man capable of commanding a room into silence with his presence, handling old silk thread with the patience of someone restoring a piece of art. After nearly 20 minutes, the seam gave way, revealing a narrow pocket sewn into the lining. Gabe reached in carefully and withdrew 2 small objects wrapped in a scrap of black cloth, each one no bigger than a fingernail. He unwrapped them slowly, revealing 2 tiny memory drives, the kind small enough to hide inside a coat button. Clara stared at them, 5 years of grief and confusion suddenly reduced to 2 pieces of plastic sitting in Gabe's palm. "That's it? That's what he died protecting?" "We don't know that he died," Gabe said quietly. "Not yet. But whatever's on these drives, someone has spent 5 years believing they were worth ending for. That tells you everything about how important they are." Clara pressed her hand against her mouth, emotion rising faster than she could control it. She'd carried this dress through 5 years of pretending to be fine, wearing it like a quiet plea into the dark, never knowing that its weight had a literal cause hidden inside the fabric the entire time. "Can you read what's on them?" she asked, once she trusted her voice again. "Not here," Gabe said. "These are old enough that most modern readers won't recognize the format. I know someone who can, but before we go anywhere, I need you to tell me everything you remember about what Julian was working on before he disappeared. Every detail, even the ones that seem unimportant." Clara sat back down, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the room. He worked for an independent oversight group investigating corporate fraud. About 6 months before he vanished, he became obsessed with one case in particular. He stopped talking about work entirely after that, which wasn't like him. He used to tell me everything, even the boring parts. Then suddenly, nothing. Did he mention any names? Clara thought hard, reaching back through years of grief-fogged memory. Once, he mentioned a company, Kessler Holdings, I think, and how their records didn't match anything filed publicly. He said something about extortion, about businesses being forced to pay to avoid manufactured lawsuits. He said it went higher than anyone realized. She paused. He never mentioned who was behind it, or if he knew, he never told me. Gabe's expression darkened slightly, something clicking into place behind his eyes. Kessler Holdings was a shell company. It folded years ago, officially due to bankruptcy. Unofficially, I always suspected it was cleaned out deliberately, records erased before anyone could dig too deep. You knew about this company? I knew of it, Gabe said carefully. My organization has rules, Mrs. Sterling. We don't touch extortion rackets that prey on legitimate businesses. It's bad for everyone, including us. A few years back, there were whispers about someone inside my own organization who might have been connected to something like this. Nothing ever proven. The person in question left before anything could be confirmed. Clara's pulse quickened. Left or disappeared? Left, Gabe said. Which is worse, in some ways. It means he's still out there, still capable of covering his tracks. He looked down at the 2 tiny drives resting in his palm. If your husband's evidence names him directly, that changes everything. It means Julian didn't just uncover a fraud scheme. He uncovered someone who used to be one of mine. The words settled heavily between them. Clara thought of the men in black suits at the gala, the way they'd known exactly which dress to look for, the years of small disturbances in her house she'd blamed on her own grieving mind. All of it suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. We need to know what's on these drives, she said, her voice steadier now, something like determination replacing the fear. Whatever it costs, I've spent 5 years not knowing. I won't spend a 6th. Gabe closed his hand gently around the 2 drives and nodded. Then we go to Brooklyn. Today, I know someone who can open these safely, someone outside my usual circle who won't ask questions I don't want answered yet. The drive into Brooklyn took 40 minutes, most of it in silence. Clara sat with the 2 tiny drives wrapped carefully in a handkerchief inside her purse, unwilling to let them out of arm's reach, even though Gabe had assured her 3 times that his car was the safest place they could be. She watched the city change through the window, glass towers giving way to warehouses, warehouses giving way to narrow streets lined with brick buildings that looked like they hadn't changed much in 50 years. This doesn't look like your kind of neighborhood, Clara said, mostly to fill the silence. That's the point, Gabe said. Nobody looks for me here. The car stopped outside a building with no sign, just a plain steel door and a security camera angled above it. Gabe led her inside, down a narrow hallway, and through a second door that opened into a space that looked nothing like the outside promised. Rows of monitors lined one wall, cables running along the floor in neat channels, the hum of servers filling the air like a low mechanical heartbeat. A woman turned from one of the monitors as they entered, younger than Clara expected, with sharp eyes and her hair pulled back tightly. "Gabe," she said, standing. "You didn't call ahead. Didn't have time, Priya," Gabe said. "This is Clara Sterling. I need you to open 2 drives, old format, probably encrypted." Priya's eyes moved to Clara with quick assessment before she held out her hand for the handkerchief. Old format, meaning what, exactly? 5 years old, Clara said. Maybe older. Priya's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't ask further questions. She carried the drives to a workstation and began connecting them to an adapter, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard. Clara stood close to Gabe, watching lines of code scroll across the screen, understanding none of it, but feeling her heart pound with every second that passed. "Encrypted, like you said," Priya muttered. "Old military-grade cipher. Whoever set this up knew what they were doing." "Can you break it?" Gabe asked. "Given enough time, I can break anything." Priya glanced at Clara. "Given who's asking, I'll skip the coffee break." The minutes stretched long. Clara found a chair near the wall and sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching Priya's fingers move across the keys in bursts, followed by long pauses. Gabe stood nearby, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the screen, with the kind of patience that came from a man used to waiting for important things. "Got something," Priya said finally, nearly an hour later. "First drive's mostly financial records, transaction logs, shell company transfers, dates going back almost 7 years. And the second?" Gabe asked. Priya's expression shifted, something careful entering her voice. "Second one's different. Looks like personal files. Notes? Some kind of journal maybe? Cross-referenced with names." "Pull it up," Gabe said. The screen filled with text. Julian's handwriting scanned and digitized. Dates marking entries stretching across nearly a year before his disappearance. Clara stood, moving closer despite herself, her eyes scanning lines that felt like hearing her husband's voice again after 5 years of silence. "They're moving money through Kessler Holdings faster than I can trace it. Whoever set this up understands both sides, legitimate business and the other kind. That worries me more than anything else. This isn't an outsider. This is someone who used to belong." Clara's breath caught. "Used to belong," she read aloud. "That's what you said too, about the person from your organization." Gabe leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening as more entries scrolled past. Names of shell companies, dates of transfers, small annotations in Julian's careful handwriting, connecting one piece of evidence to another, like a man building a case he knew might never see a courtroom. Then, Priya scrolled to an entry near the end, and the room went quiet. "I finally have the name. Silas Thorne. Former chief accountant, Vance Syndicate, left the organization 4 years before I started digging. He built Kessler Holdings as a shell to launder extortion payments from at least a dozen legitimate businesses across the state, using his old contacts to make it look untraceable. If anything happens to me, this drive proves everything. Clara, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears blurring the screen in front of her. 5 years of silence, and here was her husband's voice, calm and methodical, even in what might have been his final entry, apologizing to her from beyond whatever had happened to him. Gabe had gone very still beside her, his expression unreadable except for the muscle working tight in his jaw. "Silas Thorne," he said quietly, like the name itself carried weight. "I know that name. You said someone from your organization left before anything could be confirmed," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Was it him?" Gabe didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something colder than Clara had heard from him yet. "Silas Thorne handled the syndicate's books for 6 years. He left quietly. No scandal, no accusations, just resigned and disappeared into private consulting. I always wondered why someone that good at his job would walk away without a fight." He looked at the screen again, at Julian's final entry glowing in the dim light of the room. "Now I know. He wasn't running from a lack of opportunity. He was running from getting caught." Priya looked between them. "You want me to trace where Thorne is now?" "Do it quietly," Gabe said. "If he finds out we have this drive before we're ready, he'll disappear for good, and Julian's evidence dies with him getting away clean." He turned to Clara, something steady and resolute settling into his expression. "We're close, Mrs. Sterling. Closer than anyone's been in 5 years. But close is dangerous. Thorne has spent 5 years covering this up. He won't stop just because we found the truth." Clara wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and looked at the screen one last time before Priya closed the file. Then, we make sure he can't cover it up anymore. Priya found the trail within 2 hours, a thread of digital breadcrumbs leading from an old Kessler Holdings server address to an active relay station registered under a shell name in Jersey City. Whoever's running this still logs in every few days, she said, pointing at a cluster of timestamps on her screen. Checking something. Maybe watching for exactly this kind of activity. Meaning he might already know we accessed the drives, Gabe said. Meaning we should assume he does, Priya answered. Gabe made calls on the drive back to the estate, his voice low and clipped, arranging things Clara didn't fully understand, but recognized as preparation. By the time they reached Jersey City that evening, 3 cars had already gathered near an empty industrial lot, Marcus and Dell among the men waiting in the fading light. "You're staying in the car," Gabe told Clara, parking a block from the warehouse. "Absolutely not," Clara said. "This is my husband's evidence. I've waited 5 years for this. I'm not sitting in a parking lot while you finish it without me." Gabe studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his eyes. "You stay behind me. You do exactly what I say, when I say it." "This isn't negotiable." Clara nodded, her heart hammering as they approached the warehouse on foot, the building dark except for a faint glow leaking from a side window. Marcus moved ahead silently, checking the perimeter, while Dell covered the rear entrance. Gabe led Clara to a side door, his movements calm and unhurried, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. Inside, the warehouse smelled like rust and old machinery, rows of server racks glowing blue in the darkness, cables snaking across the concrete floor like veins. A single figure sat hunched at a terminal near the back, headphones on, unaware of the intrusion until Marcus's flashlight swept across his face. The man startled, hands flying toward the keyboard, but Gabe was already moving, closing the distance faster than Clara thought possible. "Don't," Gabe said, his voice carrying a warning that needed no volume to be effective. "Whatever you're about to do, don't." The man froze, hands hovering over the keys. He was young, barely older than a college student, his face pale in the glow of the monitors. "I'm just contract work," he stammered. "I don't know anything about what's on these servers, I swear." "Who hired you?" Gabe asked. "An intermediary. I never met him in person. I just maintain the system, keep it running, report if anyone tries to access it remotely." The man's eyes darted toward the keyboard again, and Clara caught the flicker of intention half a second before Gabe did. "He's trying to trigger a wipe," she said sharply. Gabe's hand closed around the man's wrist before he could move further. Firm, but controlled. No violence in the motion. Just absolute prevention. "Last chance," Gabe said. "Tell me how to stop the wipe sequence, or you explain to the people who actually own this evidence why it's gone." The man's resolve cracked fast. "There's a manual override, physical switch, on the second server rack. It's supposed to be for maintenance, but it'll stop any remote command mid-execution." Marcus was already moving, scanning the racks with quick precision until he found the panel, a small red switch tucked behind a service door. He flipped it, and the blue glow of the monitors flickered once before stabilizing. "Wipe sequence halted," Priya's voice came through Gabe's earpiece, patched in remotely from Brooklyn. "Whatever they were trying to erase, it's still there. I'm pulling a full copy of the server contents now, just in case." Clara let out a breath she'd been holding since they entered the building. Around her, the warehouse felt less threatening now, just a cold industrial space full of old equipment and one frightened young man who clearly hadn't understood what he'd gotten himself into. "Who's the intermediary?" Gabe asked again, releasing his grip slightly. I only have a name. Corvus. That's all he ever gave me." The man swallowed hard. Payments came through an account I never traced back further than a numbered holding company. Gabe exchanged a glance with Marcus, something passing between them that Clara couldn't fully read. "Corvus," Gabe repeated quietly. "That's not a name Thorn would use carelessly. It means he's still being careful, even now." "What happens to him?" Clara asked, nodding toward the young man still frozen at the terminal. "He walks away," Gabe said, "assuming he answers a few more questions honestly and never comes near this warehouse again." He turned back to the man. "You're going to disappear from this line of work entirely." "Understood." The man nodded rapidly, relief flooding his face. Outside, the night air felt colder than it had an hour ago, or maybe it was just the weight of everything settling over Clara at once. Julian's evidence was safe. The relay station was disabled. And somewhere out there, Silas Thorn, hiding behind the name Corvus, was likely realizing that his years of careful silence had just been broken. "He'll know we found this place," Clara said as they walked back toward the cars. "Won't he?" "Probably within the hour," Gabe admitted. "Which means our window to move carefully just got a lot smaller." Clara looked back at the warehouse, dark and quiet again behind them, and felt something shift inside her chest, fear tangled together with a fierce, unfamiliar determination. 5 years of not knowing had ended today. Whatever came next, she intended to see it through to the end, no matter how dangerous that end turned out to be. "Then we stop being careful," she said, "and start being ready." The cabin sat at the edge of Lake George, tucked far enough into the trees that the water was only visible through gaps in the pines, silver under the moonlight. Gabe had arranged the move within an hour of leaving the warehouse, insisting that the estate, safe as it was still a known property tied to his name. Thorn would look there first. "Nobody knows about this place," Gabe said, carrying Clara's bag inside. "Not Marcus, not Dell. Only Priya, and she doesn't talk." The cabin was smaller than Clara expected. Warm wood walls, a stone fireplace already stacked with logs, a single lamp glowing on a side table. It felt less like a hideout and more like somewhere a person actually chose to spend quiet time, which struck her as strange, given everything she now knew about the man standing across the room from her. "You come here often?" she asked, mostly to break the heavy silence that had followed them from Jersey City. "When I need to think without interruptions," Gabe said, kneeling by the fireplace to light the logs. "It's the one place I don't have to be anyone in particular." Clara sat on the edge of the couch, still wearing the wine-colored dress she hadn't changed out of since the previous night, the same dress that had started all of this. She watched the fire catch, small flames climbing the dry wood, and let herself finally exhale after a day that felt like it had lasted a week. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You've been asking me things all day," Gabe said, a faint edge of dry humor in his voice as he settled into the chair across from her. "Might as well keep going." "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked. "Really, you could have handed those men at the gala whatever they wanted and walked away clean. Instead, you're risking everything, your organization, your reputation, maybe your life, over evidence that doesn't even benefit you directly." Gabe was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire like he was deciding how much of the truth to give her. "My family built something with rules," he finally said. "Real rules, not the kind people assume when they hear what we do. We don't touch extortion. We don't prey on legitimate businesses. My father used to say that once you start stealing from people who never chose this life, you stop being anything worth respecting. And Thorn broke that rule." "Thorn didn't just break it," Gabe said, his voice hardening. He used my organization's name and reputation to make his scheme look untouchable. Every business he extorted, every dollar he stole, some of it happened under the assumption that crossing him meant crossing us. That's not just theft. That's theft wearing my family's face. Clara studied him in the firelight, seeing something she hadn't expected beneath the composed, dangerous exterior he carried everywhere else. This wasn't only about justice for Julian. It was personal for Gabe, too, in a way she hadn't fully understood until now. I have no interest in the money on that server, Gabe continued. I don't want the drives. I don't want to sell them. I don't want to use them for leverage against anyone. I want Thorn exposed, publicly, undeniably, in front of people who can't look away or pretend it didn't happen. And I want Julian's name cleared, because he deserved better than what the world gave him for doing the right thing. Clara's eyes stung, and she looked away toward the fire, giving herself a moment before she trusted her voice. Everyone told me he ran from his debts, that he was ashamed, that he couldn't face what he'd done. I stopped believing them years ago, but I never had proof. Just this feeling in my chest that the man I married would never do that to me. You were right, Gabe said quietly, about all of it. They sat in silence for a while after that, the fire crackling, the lake wind pressing gently against the windows. Clara found herself studying Gabe's face in the low light, the sharp lines that made him look older than 28, the way exhaustion sat behind his eyes, even though his posture never wavered. You barely know me, she said eventually. Yet you've put your entire operation at risk for a woman you met yesterday. I knew Julian, Gabe said simply. That's enough of a reason for me. And you, he added, meeting her eyes directly. You wore that dress into a room full of people who mocked you, hoping it might lead you closer to the truth about your husband. That took more courage than most people I've worked with in this business. The words settled somewhere deep in Clara's chest, warm in a way she hadn't expected after such a long, cold day. Nobody's called me courageous in a long time, she admitted, mostly just tired, or foolish for still wearing an outdated dress to events I have no business attending. They were wrong, Gabe said, about the dress and about you. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar after years of numbness, and she looked toward the fire again to hide it. What happens now? With Thorn, I mean. Now we make him overconfident, Gabe said, his tone shifting back into something more strategic. He knows we found the relay station. He'll assume we're rattled, moving carelessly. That assumption is exactly what I want him to have. You have a plan already. I've had the outline of one since Brooklyn, Gabe admitted. I just needed to know how far you were willing to go to see it through. Clara straightened, the exhaustion in her body giving way to something steadier, something that felt almost like purpose. I've spent 5 years waiting for someone to believe me. I'm not backing away now that someone finally does. Gabe held her gaze across the firelight, something unspoken passing between them, equal parts respect, and the early, cautious beginnings of trust neither of them had expected to find in the middle of all this danger. Then let's talk about how we're going to end this. The message arrived just after midnight, delivered through an encrypted channel Priya had flagged the moment it appeared. Gabe's phone buzzed twice on the cabin's kitchen table, and Clara watched his expression shift from calm to something colder as he read it. It's him, Gabe said. Thorn. Clara moved closer, reading over his shoulder, despite the way her hands had gone cold. The message was short, typed in plain text, with no signature, but the meaning underneath it was unmistakable. I know what you found in Jersey City. I know whose evidence it is. You have until tomorrow night to hand over both drives, or I release altered records to every business partner and regulatory contact your family has spent 30 years cultivating. Your empire survives on trust, Vance. I can end that trust in one email." "He's bluffing," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly. "He's not," Gabe said, setting the phone down carefully. "Thorne spent 6 years inside my organization's finances. He knows exactly which records to alter and exactly who would believe them without question. He's not threatening something he can't do. Then what do we do?" Gabe was quiet for a long moment, staring at the darkened window, the lake barely visible beyond the glass. "We don't give him the drives. That was never on the table. The moment he has that evidence back, Julian's death, everything he did to those businesses, all of it, disappears with a keystroke. So we call his bluff," Clara said. "You said he's not bluffing. He's not bluffing about the threat," Gabe clarified. "But threats like this only work if the person making them stays hidden. Thorne has spent 5 years being careful, using intermediaries, shell names, people like the boy in that warehouse, to keep his own hands clean. The moment he has to show his face, his leverage disappears, because now he's not a rumor anymore. He's a target with a name." Clara sat down slowly, processing what he was suggesting. "You want him to show his face?" "I want him standing in a room full of people who can't unhear what he says," Gabe said. "Not threatened into confessing. Tricked into it. Made comfortable enough to believe he's already won. So comfortable that he says more than he intends to. How do you trick a man like that into confessing?" Gabe leaned back, something calculating settling into his expression, the same quiet intensity Clara imagined he carried into every serious decision he'd ever made. "You give him exactly what he's asking for, or what looks like it." Clara's eyes widened. "The drives, copies," Gabe said. "Priya already pulled everything off them before we left Brooklyn. We can hand Thorne convincing duplicates, enough to satisfy him in the moment, while the real evidence stays protected. He won't know the difference until it's far too late to matter. And the confession part? That requires him believing he's safe," Gabe said. "Believing he's outsmarted us, that he's won, that there's no consequence coming. Men like Thorne can't resist explaining exactly how clever they were, especially to people they think can no longer stop them." Clara thought of Julian's final journal entry, the calm, careful way he documented everything even as his world collapsed around him. Her husband had spent his life building cases on facts, patience, and proof. Now she was sitting across from a man willing to build a trap out of nothing but psychology and nerve. "Where does this happen?" she asked. "Somewhere public, you said before. Somewhere he can't disappear afterward." "I have a location in mind," Gabe said. "A gallery downtown, closed after hours, for a private showing. Neutral ground, the kind of place Thorne would consider safe, because it has no connection to either of us directly. It also happens to have wiring throughout the building for security and media events, wiring my people can repurpose without anyone noticing. You want to record him? I want to broadcast him," Gabe corrected. "Live, to people who matter, investigators, journalists, regulatory contacts who've been quietly circling Kessler Holdings for years without enough proof to move. If Thorne confesses in that room, believing he's speaking only to us, the whole thing becomes undeniable the moment it reaches the right eyes." Clara felt something steady settle into her chest, replacing the fear that had lived there since the message first appeared on Gabe's phone. "I want to be there." "Clara, he finished my husband," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "Or as good as ending him. Whatever actually happened 5 years ago, I've spent 5 years being talked about, decided for, protected from truths other people thought I couldn't handle. I'm done with that. If this ends tomorrow night, I want to be in the room when it does." Gabe studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes, concern tangled with the same respect he'd shown her since the ballroom. "It won't be safe." "Nothing has been safe since I put this dress on 2 nights ago," Clara said. "I'd rather face him standing beside the person who's actually trying to help me than sit somewhere quiet, waiting to hear how it turned out secondhand." Gabe exhaled slowly, and Clara watched some internal argument resolve itself behind his expression. "Then you stay close to me the entire time." No exceptions, no wandering off to confront him alone, no matter what he says in that room. "Can you promise me that?" "I promise," Clara said. Gabe picked up his phone again, already typing out instructions to Priya and Marcus, arrangements moving quickly now that the plan had a shape. Clara watched him work, steady and precise, and thought about how strange it was that 2 days ago she'd been a woman laughed at for an outdated dress, and now she was preparing to walk into a trap designed to unravel 5 years of lies in a single night. Whatever happened tomorrow, she intended to see Julian's name cleared. No matter what it cost her to get there, the Metropolitan Art Gallery sat quiet, under its own private darkness by the time Clara and Gabe arrived, the public hours long over, the front windows dimmed except for a single row of lights, illuminating a hallway of paintings near the entrance. Gabe had chosen the location carefully, a place with history, elegant enough that Thorne would believe the meeting carried the weight he demanded, private enough that nobody outside their circle would question why the doors were locked to the public that night. "He'll come through the main entrance," Gabe said, walking Clara through the layout one final time. Priya's team rewired the security cameras and the sound system this afternoon. Everything gets fed live to a secure channel. Investigators and 2 journalists Priya trusts are watching remotely, ready to record whatever happens in this room. Clara looked around at the gallery. Tall ceilings, soft lighting, angled to highlight the artwork rather than the people beneath it. A row of paintings lined the far wall, landscapes and portraits from artists she didn't recognize, and something about the quiet elegance of the space made the danger feel almost surreal, like violence didn't belong somewhere this beautiful. "Julian would have appreciated this place," she said quietly, studying one of the paintings near the entrance, a river scene rendered in soft blues and golds. "He used to bring me to galleries when we were first married. Said it was the only place his mind actually slowed down." Gabe glanced at the painting, something unreadable crossing his face. "Then it's fitting, in a way, finishing this here." Marcus and Dell moved through the space methodically, checking sightlines, confirming positions near the exits without making their presence obvious to anyone glancing in from outside. Priya's voice crackled occasionally through Gabe's earpiece, confirming the audio feeds, the camera angles, the connection to the investigators waiting remotely. "Copies are ready," Gabe said, holding up a small case containing what looked identical to the original drives, indistinguishable from the real thing unless someone had the exact tools Priya used to open them in the first place. Convincing enough to satisfy him in the moment. He won't have time to verify them before the room does what it's designed to do. Clara nodded, though her hands had started trembling despite her best efforts to control them. What if he doesn't take the bait? What if he suspects something's wrong the moment he walks in? "Then we adjust," Gabe said simply. But Thorne spent 5 years hiding behind intermediaries and shell names. He's never had to face someone directly in a situation like this. Men who operate that way tend to underestimate how exposed they actually are the moment they finally step into the open. A soft chime sounded through Gabe's earpiece. Cars approaching the front entrance, Priya said. One vehicle, 2 men inside, matches the description from the warehouse. Clara's stomach tightened. It's happening. Gabe touched her arm gently, steadying her without a word. Stay close. Let me lead the conversation. If he says anything directed at you, don't respond unless I signal you to. We need him talking freely, not defensive. The gallery's front doors opened a few minutes later, and Silas Thorne walked in flanked by 2 bodyguards, his presence entirely different from what Clara had imagined. He wasn't imposing or menacing in any obvious way. He was unremarkable, mid-50s, gray at the temples, dressed like someone who belonged in a boardroom rather than a criminal underworld. That ordinariness made him somehow more unsettling. Vance, Thorne said, his eyes sweeping the gallery before settling on Clara. And the widow. How touching. Bringing her along to witness the transaction personally. She has a right to be here, Gabe said evenly. This concerns her husband. Her husband was an inconvenience, Thorne said, a faint, careless smile touching his mouth. Nothing more. I assume you brought what I asked for. Gabe held up the case. Confirm we're alone first. Thorne gestured, and his bodyguard stepped back toward the entrance, giving the illusion of privacy that Clara knew was carefully staged on both sides of this conversation. There, Thorne said. Satisfied? The drives, Gabe said, setting the case on a nearby pedestal, but keeping his hand resting on top of it. Before I hand these over, I want to hear you say it. All of it. I want to understand exactly what my organization's reputation was used to cover for. Thorne's smile widened slightly, an edge of pride slipping into his expression, exactly the kind of vanity Gabe had been counting on. You want a confession, he said, almost amused. Fine, I'll indulge you, Vance, since you're about to hand me the only proof that any of it happened. Clara felt her pulse pounding in her ears, every instinct telling her to stay perfectly still, perfectly silent, exactly as Gabe had instructed. Somewhere beyond these walls, she knew, investigators and journalists were watching this exact moment unfold, waiting for Thorne to say the words that would finally, after 5 years, prove everything Julian had died trying to expose. Thorne straightened his jacket, glancing once more at Clara, with something almost like contempt. Your husband was clever, he said. I'll give him that much credit. He found the pattern in Kessler Holdings faster than anyone else who came looking. Faster than I expected, honestly. I couldn't let him finish what he started. The room seemed to hold its breath around them, the quiet elegance of the gallery suddenly feeling like the calm surface over something far darker underneath. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides, 5 years of grief and uncertainty crystallizing into this single unbearable moment, waiting for the rest of the truth to finally arrive. Gabe's expression stayed perfectly composed, giving nothing away, though Clara caught the subtle tension in his shoulders, the readiness coiled beneath his calm exterior. Go on, he said quietly. Tell us exactly what happened to him. Thorne's smile faded into something colder, the pride he'd carried into the room shifting toward something almost clinical, like a man reciting a report he'd given 100 times in his own head, but never out loud. Julian Sterling wasn't supposed to get as far as he did, he said. I built Kessler Holdings carefully. Layers of shell companies, false invoices, extortion payments disguised as consulting fees. It should have been untraceable. It was untraceable. For years, until your husband started pulling threads nobody else even noticed existed. He noticed the pattern in your transfer timing, Clara said, unable to stay silent any longer, despite Gabe's earlier instruction. Didn't he? The dates that didn't match public filings. Thorne's eyes flicked to her, mild surprise crossing his face, before settling back into practiced calm. "Very good, Mrs. Sterling. Your husband found the same inconsistency. Small, easy to overlook unless someone was looking specifically for it. He was thorough, too thorough for his own good." "What did you do to him?" Clara asked, her voice tight but steady. "I made sure he stopped looking," Thorne said simply, an evasive elegance in the way he chose his words, careful even now to avoid saying anything that sounded like an outright admission of violence. How he stopped is a detail I don't intend to share with an audience, even a small one. Gabe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice stayed level. "You framed him, made it look like he ran from debts he never owed, destroyed his reputation so nobody would keep investigating after he was gone." "That part was easy," Thorne said, something like satisfaction creeping into his tone now, the vanity Gabe had been counting on fully surfacing. "A few altered financial records, a rumor planted with the right journalist, and suddenly an honest investigator becomes a coward who fled his responsibilities. Nobody questions a story that confirms what they already want to believe." "And Kessler Holdings," Gabe said. "You used my organization's name to make your extortion targets believe crossing you meant crossing the syndicate." "A useful reputation," Thorne said, spreading his hands slightly. "Businesses pay quietly when they believe refusing means facing people like you, Vance. I simply borrowed the fear your family spent decades building." "Efficient, don't you think?" Gabe's expression had gone very still, the kind of stillness Clara now recognized as controlled fury rather than calm. "You built an entire scheme on my family's name and my organization's reputation, extorted a dozen legitimate businesses, and had a good man finish to protect it." "I protected myself," Thorne corrected. "Sterling made a choice to keep digging after every reasonable warning. I simply made sure his choice had permanent consequences." He glanced toward the case, still resting under Gabe's hand. "Now, the drives, if you don't mind. I've indulged your curiosity long enough." Gabe didn't move. Instead, he glanced toward the ceiling briefly, a motion so small Clara almost missed it, and she remembered suddenly what he'd told her earlier that day. Everything Thorne had just said, every careful, prideful word, had been broadcast live the entire time. "There's something you should know," Gabe said. "This conversation was never private." Thorne's confidence cracked for the first time, his eyes darting toward the corners of the gallery, toward the security cameras he'd assumed were disabled for this meeting. "What are you talking about?" "Everything you just said," Gabe continued, "has been recorded and broadcast to investigators and journalists who've been circling Kessler Holdings for years without enough evidence to move against you. You just gave them everything they needed, in your own words, on your own terms." Thorne's face drained of color, the calculated calm collapsing into something desperate. He turned toward his bodyguards near the entrance, already barking an order, but Marcus and Dell had positioned themselves precisely where Gabe intended, closing the distance before either man could react. Small devices in their hands crackled once, a brief pulse of light and sound, and both bodyguards crumpled to the floor, disabled but unharmed, groaning as their muscles temporarily refused to cooperate. "You planned this from the start," Thorne said, backing toward the gallery's far wall, panic finally breaking through his composure. "The drives, the confession, all of it. You confessed to ending an honest man because you couldn't resist telling everyone how clever you were," Gabe said, stepping forward slowly. "That part, you did entirely yourself." Thorne's eyes darted toward a side door near the paintings, calculating an escape route that didn't exist, since Dell had already moved to block it, standing with the same quiet stillness Clara had noticed in him from the very beginning. There was nowhere left to run inside the gallery's carefully controlled space. "The gallery has a reinforced vault," Gabe said, nodding toward a heavy steel door near the back of the room, originally built to protect valuable artwork during off-hours. "You're going to wait in there until the people who watched your confession arrive to collect you personally." "This isn't over," Thorne said, his voice losing its earlier composure entirely, replaced by something brittle and afraid. "You have no legal authority to hold me anywhere." "I don't need legal authority," Gabe said. "I need about 20 minutes, which is roughly how long it'll take the investigators watching that live feed to get here, with people who do." Marcus and Dell moved Thorne and his 2 bodyguards toward the vault without resistance, the earlier show of confidence completely gone from all 3 men now. Clara watched the heavy door close, the mechanism locking with a solid, final sound that felt like 5 years of grief finally sealing shut around the truth instead of around her uncertainty. She turned to Gabe, tears finally breaking free after holding them back through the entire confrontation. "It's done," she whispered. "He actually said it. All of it. It's done," Gabe agreed quietly, reaching out to steady her as the weight of everything finally settled over both of them. "Julian's name is about to be cleared, Clara. Everything he sacrificed to expose this, it wasn't for nothing." 6 days passed before Clara stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, and every one of them felt like a different chapter of a life she hadn't expected to live. Investigators had arrived at the gallery within 20 minutes, just as Gabe promised, taking Thorne and his bodyguards into custody while the recorded confession played on a laptop screen for everyone present to witness firsthand. By morning, the story had already reached the financial pages, though Gabe had made sure his own name stayed carefully out of the official record. "You could have taken credit," Clara said to him during the drive downtown that final morning, the September air crisp through the car's cracked window, "for catching him, for exposing everything." "I don't need credit," Gabe said. "I need my family's name separated from his crimes, and I need Julian's name cleared. Both of those things happened. That's enough for me." The courthouse plaza was crowded when they arrived. Reporters gathered near the steps, a small group of federal investigators waiting near the entrance with folders in hand. Clara recognized one of the lead investigators from the gallery that night, a woman named Reyes who had personally overseen the confirmation of Julian's evidence against the financial records seized from Thorne's operation. "Mrs. Sterling," Reyes said, approaching with a manila folder, "we've completed our review. Everything your husband documented 5 years ago checked out precisely as he recorded it. Kessler Holdings, the extortion payments, the falsified records used to frame him. All of it confirmed." Clara's hands trembled as she accepted the folder, official government letterhead confirming what she'd known in her heart for 5 years, but had never been able to prove to anyone else. "So it's official," she said quietly. "He wasn't a coward. He wasn't running from debts he never owed." Julian Sterling was an honest investigator who uncovered a significant fraud scheme and paid for it with his life, Reyes said. "His name is being formally cleared, effective today. We're also recovering assets that were wrongfully seized from your accounts during the original fraudulent investigation into his conduct. That process starts this week." The words hit Clara harder than she expected. 5 years of whispered judgments from people who'd once called themselves friends, of in-laws who stopped answering her calls, of official reports that painted her husband as a man who'd abandoned his responsibilities out of shame. All of it, finally, undone in a single conversation on a courthouse plaza. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. You don't know what this means. Actually, I think I do, Reyes said, glancing briefly toward Gabe before returning her attention to Clara. Your husband's evidence exposed a scheme that had been extorting businesses across this state for nearly a decade. That kind of courage deserves recognition, even 5 years late. Reyes excused herself to speak with the reporters waiting nearby, leaving Clara and Gabe alone near the edge of the plaza, the marble steps of the courthouse rising behind them like something solid and permanent after years of uncertain ground. I don't know how to thank you for any of this, Clara said, turning to face him fully. You didn't have to get involved. You could have walked past me at that gala without a second glance, and none of this would have happened. I couldn't have walked past you, Gabe said, not once I recognized that dress and understood what it meant. Julian deserved someone to finish what he started. I'm glad I could be part of that. Clara looked down at the folder in her hands, then back up at him, something warm settling into her chest that she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to admit. What happens to Thorne now? Federal prosecution, Gabe said. Extortion, fraud, and enough financial crimes to keep him occupied for the rest of his life. He'll never see the outside of a courtroom as anything but a defendant again. He paused, something more careful entering his voice. As for my organization, this exposed the risk of someone using our reputation against us. We're implementing changes because of it. Better oversight, faster response, if something like this ever happens again. You turned Thorne's betrayal into something that makes your operation stronger, Clara said. That sounds like exactly what my husband would have respected about you. Gabe's expression softened at that, something almost unguarded crossing his face for the first time since Clara had met him 5 days ago. I meant what I said at the cabin. Julian was one of the few people from outside my world who ever understood it without judging it entirely. I think he would have wanted someone to look after the people he cared about if he couldn't do it himself. Clara felt tears rise again, though these ones carried none of the grief that had defined the last 5 years. I don't know what comes next for me, she admitted. I've spent so long fighting for this moment, I never let myself think past it. You don't have to figure that out today, Gabe said, but I want you to know something. Regardless of whatever you decide next, as long as I lead my family, you'll have a place of protection within it, not out of obligation. Out of respect for what Julian did and what you've done these past 5 days to finish it. Clara studied him for a long moment, the late morning sun catching the sharp lines of his face, softer now than she'd seen them at any point since the ballroom. That's a generous offer for a woman you met because of an outdated dress. That dress carried the truth for 5 years, Gabe said, a faint smile finally breaking through his usual composure. I'd say it's earned a little more respect than that. Clara laughed, surprised by the sound of it, unfamiliar after years of careful, guarded silence. She looked out at the courthouse plaza, at the reporters gathering Reyes's official statement, at the folder in her hands that finally, after 5 long years, told the truth about the man she'd loved. Thank you, Gabe, she said, for believing me before you had any real reason to. Julian gave me every reason, Gabe said quietly. You just needed someone willing to finish what he started. They stood together on the courthouse steps as the late morning light spread across the plaza, 5 years of grief finally settling into something quieter, something that felt, for the first time since Julian disappeared, like the beginning of peace instead of the ache of unanswered questions.